So good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us and for coming to our panel, Life Without Them, Men Writing About Those They've Lost. My name is Kelly Grey Carlisle. I teach nonfiction and memoir writing at Trinity University, and I'll be your moderator. We're so lucky to be able to speak today with these amazing writers, Adam Mansbach and Gregory Curtis, about their new books. Before we get started, a few logistical things. You may ask questions through the Q&A chat box on the right hand of your screen. We'll be opening the talk up to questions about halfway through our time, although you're welcome to type them as they occur to you. We hope you'll consider purchasing these great books from Nowhere Bookshop, the book festival's bookstore. Independent bookstores have had a hard time during the pandemic, and so we hope you'll support them and these writers and the festival by purchasing their excellent books. Just click on the Buy the Book button on the festival website. I'd also like to remind you that the San Antonio Book Festival is the signature event for the San Antonio Public Library Foundation. Libraries are vital resources to a flourishing city, and I hope you'll support yours. Finally, I'd like to give a shout out and many thanks to our awesome technical volunteer, Valerie Carroll, who will be assisting us with this panel and with the Q&A. It is my honor to introduce our two writers. Greg Curtis is the author of The Cave Painters, Probing the Mysteries of the World's First Artists, and Disarmed, the Story of the Venus de Milo. He was editor of Texas Monthly from 1981 until 2000. His work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Fortune, Time, and Rolling Stone, among other publications. A graduate of Rice University and San Francisco State College, he lives in Austin. His latest book is what we'll be talking about today, the memoir, Paris Without Her. Adam Mansbach is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Go the Fuck to Sleep, the novels Rage is Back, Angry Black White Boy, The End of the Jews, which won the California Book Award, and a dozen other books, most recently the bestselling A Field Guide to the Jewish People, co-written with Dave Barry and Alan Zweibel. Mansbach wrote the award-winning screenplay for the Netflix original Barry, and his next feature film, Super High, starring Andy Samberg, Craig Robinson, and Common, is forthcoming from New Line. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Book Review, Esquire, The Believer, The Guardian, and on NPR's This American Life, The Moth, and All Things Considered. Today we'll be talking about his new book, the memoir in verse, I Had a Brother Once, a memoir, a poem. So to get started, I would actually really love for Adam and Greg to introduce their books to you themselves. So Greg, perhaps you could go first.
All right. I lost my wife after being married for 35 years in January 2011, and we had made a number of trips to Paris together, which we really enjoyed. And after her death, I found myself drawn to Paris again, and I began spending as much time as I could there. And during the course of that, I started to wonder if there was a book about Paris in me. There are only, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million books about Paris, but I still thought that maybe there was one in me. And in September of 2018, I got an email out of the blue from a friend in Paris who has an apartment and said, we're going to be gone from January until June 2019. Do you want the apartment? And I wrote back, yes. I didn't even think about it. I didn't allow myself to think about it because I thought I would think myself out of it. So now I had an apartment, and what was I going to do? And I began talking to my friend Steve Harrigan, the author. Many people in the audience have probably read his work. And in the course of those conversations, he said, oh, your title should be Paris Without Her. And when he said those three words, the book kind of in very rough shape and outline, but I could see the book that I would write with that title. So off I went in early 2019 and installed myself in the apartment and started to write. And the book, the resulting book, there's grief in the book, but I don't think of it as a book about grief. I think of it really more as a book about happiness, because I write about our happiness together in Paris, but also just here in Austin and so on. And then the happiness, or at least contentment, that I found after that. So those are the themes of the book, and in rough outline, there you are.
Cool, thank you so much. Adam, I think you're gonna, as by way of introducing your book, you're going to read some from it. And so if you wanted to go ahead and do that.
Thank you, yeah. I'm finding in the early days of talking about this book that it's easier to introduce it by way of just reading a little bit of it. So do a couple brief sections, beginning with one that is essentially, I have just heard the news from a phone call from my father that my brother David has taken his own life. My father's sentence was unrecognizable, a cluster of words spinning in a void. The notion that it was all a mistake flashed through me and fell instantly to ash. No parent would say such a thing about his child, to his child, if there was any hope. And here begins a different kind of struggle on this page, akin to keeping the steering wheel perfectly straight. A struggle not to crane out of this shot, not to add voiceover, not to do the one thing I am trained to, which is make things legible, impose structure and plot, motivation, a frame, a double helix of narrative to snake through the spine, to be the spine. Here I am, here we are, not 50 feet from the news of my brother's suicide, and already I can feel a tug at the reins. I don't know if naming these things can sap their power, or if it constitutes a sacrifice at their altar, an invitation to the impulse I am trying to disperse. What are the rules of this endeavor? Am I supposed to unfold the moments of this night like an origami crane, crease by crease? Is that the penance or the healing, the ritual, a march toward or away from what? Penance for what? If you are making up the ritual as you go, is it a ritual? If the loss is a hole that cannot be filled, is the remainder of your life the ritual? Are rituals supposed to fill the hole or deepen it until you can crawl out the other side? And who am I that I have to ask? My mother's father's parents were the children of famed rabbis. They came here and founded a Jewish community in Burlington, Vermont, by paying other Jews to keep the Sabbath, making them whole and a minion by handing out the wages they would have lost in observing the holy day. And here I am, not even 150 years later, acting as if the books my people carried and died for are unknown to me. Here I am, freighted by nothing, reinventing the wheel, reinventing the rack, daring to believe that perhaps you only realize a ritual was one after you complete it, inscribe the final character, a tear falls on the page, becomes the final period, or some stupid maudlin shit like that. The final moment is what I dwell on most. He is sitting in his Subaru overlooking nothing, the ass end of a parking lot, the chemicals he will mix into a gas that kills him lying in his lap, knowing he is one breath away, that he could end it all right now. Though any of us could, really, it is always right now. There are heights and cars, things to fling yourself off or in front of. There is always a drawer full of knives. I imagine he is crying, but that is only because I would be. Perhaps he is laughing, or luxuriating in the sudden vivid crispness of the world, the miraculous dispersal of cumulonimbus formations in a southwesterly wind, and feeling free at last. Or just as likely he is stone-faced with determination, so close, just one final push. Perhaps the act was a ritual, a series of gestures rehearsed and enacted with faithful, reverent precision, the implements delicate in his large hands like eyedroppers, carrot peelers. It is all unfathomable. I cannot place myself in him. I'm throwing cliches at the wall. They say a velvet calm descends when people have decided, gathered their supplies, chosen a place, an hour, their moods lighten and their loved ones think they've turned a corner, which they have, a different corner. But in my head, that's where he always is. sitting in his car with me screaming, "Don't do it," from the back seat like some spirit cursed to be unheard. And my mother's father's parents, the famous rabbi's kids, the minion makers of Burlington, Vermont, they squat atop the glass floor of the distant beyond, shaking their great woolly heads and asking why, of all things, did it have to be gas?
It's so powerful. Thank you very much. So,
Thanks.
both of you, the title of this panel and its description focus on loss. And I think Greg's already alluded to the fact that he sees his book as much more than about grief. And we'll get to the loss and the grief in a moment. But I was wondering if we could, for a moment, focus on the people whom you've lost. And so, Greg, I was wondering, could you please tell us just a little bit about Tracy and who she was?
Well, the beginning of Paris Without Her is the moment when I saw her for the first time, and was here in the very early days of Texas Monthly in a rundown building where our offices were that is torn down long ago. And I was sitting in the writers, what was in effect the writers' bullpen. There were 3 other writers and me, and Tracy appeared in the doorway. She was beautiful, and her clothes, her hair was marvelous, and her clothes were very stylish, but not too much. Just everything about her was stunning, and I loved her. And as I say in the book, in that moment, I knew, I didn't know that I would marry her, but I did know that I loved her. And we went from there. I mean, we couldn't not be together. And through our 35 years, there were many ups and downs, as you might imagine, but we always were, there was a cement between us that was very powerful. She was extremely gracious toward people. She had a wonderful manner. She was magic with children, her own children. She had 4 children. She was magic with them, but with any child. And her taste in anything visual was impeccable. And this combination of a really gracious, warm personality, fascinated by children in an aesthetic sense that was instinctive, but also developed over time and work, made her unique, I believe.
Thank you. Both from reading the book and from hearing you talk to her, she sounds like a person that I would be so glad to know. I was wondering, why do you think Paris was so attractive to her and to you? And obviously that's a great deal of the book, but I was just wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the Paris you shared, because if Tracy's a character in this book, certainly Paris is as well.
We both bought the mythology before we'd been to Europe, much less Paris. We just believed in Paris, that it was beautiful, that it was romantic, that it was this wonderful, wonderful place. And we tried to learn French together. We read French novels together. And when finally, we were old, relatively, we were 37 and 38 the first time we went to Europe and to Paris. And when we got there, finally, after that time, we found, lo and behold, it really is beautiful. It really is romantic. And the food really is good. And things like that, little things and big things. And that after the first trip, in fact, after the first day, we were overcome with Paris, and we were in love with Paris, and it never left, and it just deepened with every trip that we took.
Well, thank you. So I thought, as I was reading the book, although you regain a Paris after Tracy's death, in a sense, you also lose Paris with her as much as you lose her in the beginning of the book. And so, Adam, do you think you could please tell me a little bit about David and what made him special? Tell us about your brother.
It's funny. One of the things that I find grappling with suicide does is it rewrites every story that you have about a person. It takes your narrative, and no matter how you might try to resist there even being a narrative, which is one of the things I struggle with in the book, is like the desire to understand versus the resistance to winnowing down something that I don't understand into one story that I am then going to tell over and over until it becomes true. Even individual moments take on this same sheen. So a story that I love about my brother, and that I told for years before he died, is about the fact that he took off his own braces. He had braces on his teeth. He didn't want them. He told my parents before he got them that he didn't want them. He said it was cosmetic surgery and he was opting out. My parents were like, he'll thank us eventually. So they made him get braces. So one day when my parents were out to dinner, and he was in, I think, 5th grade and I was in 8th grade, I was out with friends doing whatever juvenile delinquent shit I was doing. And I came home to, get something I had forgotten. And my brother answers the door, and he's got wires protruding from his face, and he's got a pair of nail clippers in one hand and like some kind of pliers in another. He assured me that he had sterilized them both, and he was taking off his own braces and videotaping it for posterity. Because he meant that shit. He was not trying to have braces, so he wasn't going to have braces. And the thing about it was not just the fact that he did it, but he did an impeccable job. Even his orthodontist had to grudgingly admit that he had really done a stellar job of removing his braces. And that's very indicative of who he was. He had his own mind. He had his own way of doing things. He was not beholden to anybody else's opinion, and he was not afraid to do things his own way. So that's the beautiful, funny story about my brother. But I also can't tell that story without sort of the mental addendum that I now make, which is, that was the first time he kind of reclaimed sovereignty over his own body, but it wasn't the last.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that story, which you recount in the book, right, is so telling of him, and you connect it right back to the suicide and the themes. I also wondered, when I asked you that question, could you tell us about your brother? So much of your book is about perhaps the betrayal, but most certainly the grief of not knowing him, in a sense, because the suicide was a surprise to most people. And certainly I don't think that you had a sense of how close he was. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, how much about writing this book is also about trying to understand or get to know something that you apparently didn't know.
Yeah. I don't think I would use the word betrayal. I mean, that's not how it feels to me, but it does feel there is a sense of trying to, there's a tension between wanting to unravel a mystery and realizing that the mystery is not going to be unraveled. And a lot of the book for me, again, is in sort of the tension between being trained both as a writer and just as a human being. What we do is we make up stories. We tell each other stories. It's what makes us human. So for me, there's on one hand an impulse to tell this story. There's also the belief that if David had told his own story, had acknowledged and been open about his depression, perhaps he could still be here. There's also, however, a resistance to the idea of there being a singular story, of the idea that I can know that story and articulate it, or that I should even try. There's also a sense of wanting to give language to my children so that if they ever have to confront something like this, depression, they will have the language my brother didn't. But there at the same time is the attempt to understand that, paradox exists not to be resolved, but to be kind of held. You know, like my cousin and I went to David's apartment after he died to like retrieve things for his wife and so forth. And like we found an email where he had ordered like an expensive skateboard, and it hadn't arrived yet. You know, like there was a part of him that was planning to die, and there was a part of him that was planning to skateboard. And you know, there's an impulse to be like, aha, you know, like a mystery to be unraveled, something isn't right. No, but that's really not it. It's like he was planning both those things. You know, I think in the book I compare it to a train station with two sets of tracks running in each direction. The attempt to sit with that non-understanding and to sit with the reality that somebody can be planning both of those things simultaneously, to live and to die. And in the book, I put forth a number of ideas and theories, and it's an attempt to understand that I'm sort of doing in real time, because I was like writing this book very quick. I wrote the whole book in like 3 weeks, and there's a lot of like discovery that's just ongoing, and theories I'm positing and then just as quickly taking back. And part of that is me figuring things out and grappling with them like almost in real time. And I think another element of that is almost to illustrate the process of not letting one narrative coagulate, you know, keeping multiple narratives like alive simultaneously, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. I mean, I think memoir and nonfiction as a genre, but especially personal writing, like lives in that space between narratives, right? And if it becomes too hardened and too simple, it's not as true, right? It's maybe something paradoxical and contradictory. Thank you for that. And so one more question to Adam, and then I've got another question for Greg that's related. So I found that this long poem, this broken prose, swift memoir, I almost want to call it, so intense and so powerful. And so I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit what led you to this form of this poem memoir form for speaking about this loss. And maybe I also know music, even from the beginning of the book, but knowing a little bit more about you, music really influences you. And I was wondering if music influenced that at all.
You know, I tried for years to figure out. I knew that I would eventually write about my brother. I didn't know how, and not knowing how was one of the things that stymied me. Like, was it a novel? Was it some kind of long form nonfiction? These are forms I work with much more frequently. I don't typically write poetry. But every time I thought about those forms, I would get ensnarled in all of the scaffolding. Like, if it was a novel, what was the plot? How close to the truth would it be? If it was an essay, what would the structure be? And my mind never really went to poetry. And then I was commissioned to write a poem for the first time in a long time for an event with the San Francisco Jazz Institute. I was going to be performing with a band, which is something I used to do all the time. And poetry is kind of my first love, but it's something I haven't really done in a while. And writing that poem and spending a week with some of my favorite poems and performing with a band, it kind of reminded me how wonderful that form can be and how liberating that form can be, precisely because you don't need as much scaffolding. You can kind of jump from idea to idea and thought to thought, and like begin a section without any clear relationship to the previous one. But as long as you get there by the end and stick the landing, much like a jazz solo, the connection will be made and the integrity of the composition will be maintained. So after that week, I came home, and my brother would have turned 40 that week. And I think the combination of being exposed to that form, newly re-exposed to that form, and kind of the emotional weight of that birthday combined to have me start writing. And I just wrote. I mean, I wrote pretty much like to the exclusion of all else for a few weeks. And I'm generally kind of allergic to any kind of like drama or magic around the process of writing. I think we need to like demystify writing. So I don't mean to sound mystical about the shit. Just me in this room writing the book, it just happened quickly, you know. But in a sense, it took me 9 years to write this book, and in another sense, it took me like 9 years and 3 weeks to write this book.
Cool. Yeah. No, thank you. That's awesome. And so, Greg, so sort of thinking about form a little bit for you too. Your first two books, I believe, are more research nonfiction, right? About art, and certainly, and as editor of Texas Monthly and writing for Texas Monthly, I'm not sure how many really personal memoir essays you wrote. What made you decide? I mean, we understand that you want to write a book about Paris. You told us that a little bit at the beginning, but what made you sort of take that departure and write such an intensely personal book as this memoir is?
Well, I didn't want to write a guidebook. I didn't think I had the ability to write a history. I didn't have the time to do the research at one level. But I had actually written several personal essays at Texas Monthly over the years. Not a lot, but there were some, and so I was comfortable with that. And again, the three words "Paris without her" were defining for me. And so when I went to Paris, I did have photographs. I had some journals that Tracy had kept, and I had long email messages that I had sent from Paris to friends and so on. So I had source material or things to jog my memory. And I just went to write. I did not know the form exactly. And this is the only thing I've ever written in my whole life, from the shortest little essay in Texas Monthly to my other books. This is the only thing that I've written not in chronology, not in the way that it appears in the book. So I actually wrote some of the when I sat down to write, I actually wrote some of the middle and later part of the book first, and then I thought, oh, well, now the beginning can be over here, and so on. So I wrote it in pieces, and it felt right. I had a goal every day of words, and I would meet my goal, and then I could go enjoy Paris and so on, and come back the next day and write some more. It was very methodical almost, and I kept trying. I wanted the language to be really simple. I wanted it to be expressive. I wanted it to have emotion, but not dripping and so on. I wanted to let the events speak for themselves. Writing is always work, but this was very, I felt good about this work each day. So there we are. I was lucky in a way. And also being in Paris, I couldn't have written the book if I had not been in Paris, so that I could go, the first hotel that we stayed in, Hotel d'Angleterre. Okay, well, what does it look like today? I could just go walk over there and look, and come back and write. That was invaluable. And the atmosphere, just the atmosphere, and the sounds you hear, and the people you see, and the things you see, all that, I think they're not, some of them are overtly in the book, but they're definitely in the atmosphere of the book, or at least I hope they are.
Absolutely. I felt, especially in the second half, your experience of Paris is so vivid and so sensory and so detailed, right? That it is very much, we get the atmosphere of the city. And so connected to that, I think that's a question I have for you is reading it is like, I feel like the first half of the book, the Paris that you and Tracy experience in a sense, and France is maybe more the visitor's experience of Paris and France, and it's wonderful and it's so meaningful to you. But the Paris of the second half, when you're living there, writing the book and learning the language, seems almost to be a different Paris, and maybe it's because you were writing as you were there, and it's more recent. But I was just wondering, like, do you think your perceptions of the town changed, or it was a different Paris, possibly because you weren't there with Tracy, right? And that so you were so completely immersed in there for such a long time, for learning the language. Like, what do you think that Paris without
I think yeah, I hadn't really formulated that distinction that you just made between visiting Paris and sort of living in Paris or being in Paris. And I think that's valid enough. Tracy and I made a few friends there and in France, so there are some scenes where we're invited to dinner and things like that. So we weren't entirely outside the general flow and hum of the city when we were there together. But yes, when I was there by myself, I had to, I could go, I didn't have to have a goal. I could just go and see what I found and see where whatever I found led me and so on. And when you're with another person, even someone you love dearly, it's much more of a negotiated, what you do during the day. Where are we going to have lunch? What are we going to do this afternoon? That's all. It's very pleasant discussion, but it's a discussion. Whereas when it's just you can get to the city, you follow where the city leads you, and it's a different thing. Plus, more of the events are in your interior. It's what you see and what you think and what you experience. Whereas when you're with someone else, it's more an exterior kind of experience that you have.
No, that makes sense, and thanks for answering that question, because it was something I had noticed in the book. This is a question for both of you, and I have a feeling you're going to answer it really differently, just because the way that the arc of your grief goes and your different approaches to writing, to grief, in the different experiences. But non-writers often ask if writing about loss is therapeutic or cathartic or a way of gaining closure. And as someone who's also written about loss, I think it's actually much more complicated than that, or at least a little more complicated than that. And so have either of you found that writing these books has helped give you any kind of relief, or had perhaps that process already begun before you set about writing them? And whoever wants to jump in first can go.
I didn't feel that it was therapeutic. Tracy died in January 2011, and I wrote this book in 2019. So there's 8 years there between her death and my writing this. And often they were rough 8 years, but not entirely. And I didn't. I wanted to. Also, it changed my life. In other words, her death, my life could not be the same. I had to recreate a life. My children are all grown. Our children are all grown. So it was up to me to do that. And so I feel, so there's that. And writing it sort of made me understand what I did and what I didn't do a little bit. So on. Funny, now the events in the book, my memory of them, the book is between them and my memory of them now. I hadn't expected that. And so if I think back on whatever various events in the book, I'm thinking of the account of those events in the book. I'm not thinking of how those they happened at the time. It's a very interesting thing. I don't know, Adam, have you found similar things or what?
I thought what you said just now about the way that the book itself supplants the memory or gets in the way of the memory or stands in the light of the memory, that's fascinating to me. And I certainly have found that can happen. You know, I think the book, I'm also, you know, I'm like instinctively resistant to the idea that the book was like therapeutic for me or provided closure for me. But if I'm honest, it was therapeutic for me. I think closure is probably a bridge too far, but there's a way in which all the writing that I have done in the now 10 years since my brother died, in the back of my mind, there was a way in which it all felt like avoidance of this book. You know, I was engaged with all the work I was doing. I was doing a lot of work in a lot of different genres and disciplines, all of it a lot of fun, and all of it comparatively light and easy. And I don't know, there's a way in which my life and my sort of work life feels much more in balance to me now that I've written this book. It was something that weighed on me. I do feel like writing is a very, very important way that I engage with and attempt to understand the world. So to not have grappled with this felt off to me, felt wrong to me, and finally doing it, I do feel different. You know, a very hard day every year is the anniversary of my brother's death. I can feel it coming from weeks away. I think I would feel it coming even if I didn't have a calendar. You know, you just recognize these things in the time of year and the tilt of the planet and the you know, the pollen count. And when I had recently finished writing the book, when that day came, there's about a month and a half between his birthday when I started and the day he died in the calendar. And I was done with it by that time. And that day felt very different for me. I felt like I could face it in a different kind of way, having done this work. So yeah, it has been therapeutic for me.
Cool, thank you. Sort of related, Hannah asks, is grief surmountable? And certainly I think, especially Greg's, but also Adam's, I think encoded in the book is, I don't know if insurmountable is what the experience is, but that coming to terms with or working through. So I think that's in your books, but maybe you could answer Hannah's question, like, is grief insurmountable? Do we get over it? Do we climb that mountain?
I think,
well, I don't think it ever goes away. If that, I don't know, you know, I think that it's always there. I think that it has affected you so that even when you're not conscious of grief or even feeling grief, that somehow it is there with you, you're carrying it along. So, but surmounting, I don't know that that's the right way to think about it, because you're not going to win. I mean, you're just not. So you have to I think you have to create your own. I mean, you have to work at happiness. In the first part of the book, when we were together talking about the marriage, we were working on being happy. That's one way of describing it. There were other things going on too, but we were doing that. And then in the second part of the book, I think I had to find a way that I could be content and happy, that I wasn't going to fulfill the loss, but I could create a life that included that loss, but that one that was not dragged down by grief, let's say that, and was not, that had joy and pleasure and happiness, but also had grief in there too. I don't know. On these questions, you start out and you think you know where you're headed, and you end up rambling.
We're among friends. We ramble. It's okay. Adam, what do you think about Hannah's question?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, surmountable, insurmountable. As long as we're sticking with this metaphor of a mountain, I think that you don't necessarily surmount it, but the mountain gets farther away, or you get farther away from the mountain, and the mountain begins to look smaller. And from a certain distance and a certain perspective, your eye line might find the top of that mountain. I think that grief changes and evolves and becomes less immediate or more manageable or something that you can predict better. And yeah, I think as Greg is alluding to, I think the direction that your life takes dictates a lot of those things. There's certainly a way to live that will ensure that the grief gets no smaller. Some people choose to live that way. Some people can't figure out how not to live that way. And I think there are also ways to live where the grief does recede a bit in your own estimation. It becomes a smaller part of your landscape. You still know where to find it. You can locate it very quickly when you want to or when you need to, and sometimes when you don't. But it's not looming over the entirety of the vista anymore. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. I talk in the book. I make reference in the book to. I would see Tracy in Paris, or feel that I had, out the corner of my eye, or so. And the kind of, I say most frequent, it only happened 2 or 3 times, but coming up out of the metro, when you climb the steps out of the metro, there's the sunlight up at the top of the stairs, and you're in the shadows at the bottom of the stairs, and so your vision is a little. I don't know, it's just a little, and you're making the exertion of climbing up the stairs. And several times I thought I saw her at the top of the metro stairs. And then of course she wasn't there, but I never felt sad about that. I felt okay about it. In fact, I'm not sure I was glad, but it was pleasant. It was an encounter of some kind, and what that I think that's one reason I was in Paris, was because at unpredictable moments things like that would happen. I would think I had seen her, or I'd heard her voice or something. Not day after day after day, but every 10 or 12 days, something like this would happen. And it would be pleasant. It's like when she comes into my dreams. It's always, she's never sick, she's never dying, she's always alive, she's happy, we're doing things, and there you go. So what? I don't know. I'm just describing what has happened to me. I have no theory about it at all.
So I'm going to take that idea about ghosts, because certainly that idea of haunting in a very gentle, good way is present in Paris Without Her, in your book, Greg. And in a strange way, one thing that struck me with the experience of reading both of these books side by side that are so very different is that you both sort of have dealings, even if it's a minor thread, with religion, and religion as a comfort or not as a comfort. Or for you, Greg, you're not religious, but you go into these old churches in Paris and feel something, and sometimes that's even Tracy's presence. And you, Adam, I think talk a lot about sort of like, and perhaps I read it wrong, like the falling away of faith or religious practice or ritual in your family, but still there are these moments where that comes back, like saying the Kaddish at the end, and the dealings with David's widow's priest, right? But how your own friend Emery, sort of this very spontaneous prayer when you first find out, is incredibly moving to you. So I think my question is, like, if we're thinking about about grief, do you see a faith or a spirituality or something coming into play with that? Like, was that ever part of your experiences of grief? And this may be just one of those nebulous questions you can't answer.
I mean, I think that it's when you need ritual that you realize you don't have any, at least in my case. I come from a long line of very secular Jews. And everybody, I think, in my family very much feels Jewish culturally, but nobody's been in a synagogue in about 100 years. You know, some members of my family are actively hostile to the very notion of organized religion. So what do you do when you experience a death, particularly a sudden and unexpected death? You sort of scramble for any structure and any ritual you can find. But it wasn't natural to us. So, you know, like I say in the book something like, we were sitting Shiva but did not know how. Instead of covering the mirrors, we became them. There was on my part, a desire. You know, these are the moments you wish you were religious. These are the moments when you look at other people's faith and realize how comforting it is and wish that you had it or believed it. My friend Emery, I happened to be with him when I found out that my brother had died. I was DJing at a club in Philly, which is not, 99 times out of 100, I would have been asleep in bed at 12:30 at night. On this particular night, I was playing records. I'd been living in Philly for a couple of years. We were about to get out of town. This was sort of a farewell party. Emery happens to be one of my very few deeply religious friends. He's Christian in the way that one ought to be Christian. And he ended up driving me to the airport and asking me if he could pray. And I have no idea what this even means. And he like put his hands on my shoulders and and I watched him like make up a prayer, which, in Judaism, that's called forgetting the words, right? We don't make up prayers. We say shit from a book that's 6,000 years old, So that was one instance. Another one, as you say, my brother's wife was Catholic. And so for sort of, out of a desire to let her feel whatever comfort she could, her priest came to our house and said some words about David in a kind of ad hoc funeral. And it was infuriating to me. Like it actually made me angry. Like I was like, what the fuck is going on right now? Who is this asshole, and why is he in my living room talking about my brother, who he barely knew, if he knew him at all? I don't know. I hope it's helping, And then a year later, on the first anniversary of my brother's death, I was back in California at this time, and not entirely even clear if everybody in my circle back in California knew what had happened, because one of the things I really, really didn't want to do was personally tell anyone the news. I did that the first time the first time I did that was so traumatic that I subsequently sort of recruited friends to make phone calls for me and let everybody know. But when I got back home, there were certain people I was like, I'm not even sure if the news got to them. So in this kind of scramble to figure out what to do with myself on the first anniversary of my brother's death, like how do you spend that day? How do you get through that day? I ended up having a gathering at my house, which coincidentally is very much in keeping with what you would do. You would unveil the tombstone in the Jewish faith on the first anniversary of a death. This is not what I was doing, but I did have a gathering at my house. And this old Jewish guy who I invited came up to me and quietly was like, listen, would you like me to say the Kaddish? Like I have a prayer book. I don't know if that would be appropriate or not. You tell. And it was like a life raft. I was like, yes, by all means, please do. And everybody joined hands, and he said this ancient prayer. And I don't know what the hell the words mean literally, but I felt the depth of them. I felt the history of them. I felt connected to the mere fact that they have been recited millions of times at millions of moments such as this. And it was extremely powerful for me. Throughout the process of grieving and of mourning, faith and ritual kind of reared their heads in different ways at different times. And sometimes it meant a lot to me, and sometimes I was mortified at how little it meant.
Yeah, I first went back to Paris so that I would be gone on Tracy's birthday, and the first birthday, well, actually the second birthday after her death, and that was a big. I just didn't want to be here. It was, and her birthday was May 11, which often was either exactly Mother's Day or right by Mother's Day, so that was a good time to get out of town. And when I'm in Paris, when I first wandered into, well, I didn't wander. I got up and went to the church just because I was curious. And I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it. Growing up, it had never occurred to me you could enjoy being in church. It was always, holy cow, how much longer is this going to last? And but no, it was not that at all. I enjoyed listening to the music. I enjoyed the ritual, and I enjoyed the moment. You're supposed to greet all your people around, wish them well, and so on, which you do. And I felt this was very much Tracy. That's very much her. She wasn't Catholic, but she was high Episcopalian, and that she fit right into that, and especially the greeting of the congregation and so on. So I felt her there, and that was a surprise to me. And so when I went back, I didn't go religiously, as it were. I didn't go every week, but I did go, and I always was glad that I had.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thanks for indulging me. In both your books, it struck me that you find and make rituals, right, for that, for the grieving process, and that even, Adam, going throughout your book, that idea that articulating, putting into words the event is sort of makes it true and real. And so, like, there's so many moments in your book, like when you make your father repeat the news twice because the first time you ask what, and that's your big regret of the day, and then later when you finally start to really speak about it, as you say, you write so many things, and then at the moth show, right, you're like, I have to talk about my sorry. And so almost writing your books becomes like a ritual for that. We have a question from Michael. I have to drink this before I ask it to you.
Hydrate. Yeah.
Yeah, goodness gracious, it must be the pollen. It's also, I mean, Greg knows this, but Adam, it's like 97 here today or something crazy. So yeah. We're kind of glad this is a virtual event. We're not all outside on an outdoor stage. Okay, so Michael asks, your books are so personal. How did you decide what to share with readers and what to keep to yourselves? Oh, what a good question.
You want to go first, Adam, or you want me to?
My answer will be very short. I put it all in there. For me, there wasn't really much calculation. I didn't really hold anything back. Well,
yeah, I'm sorry.
I mean, there are things that aren't in the book, but mostly because they don't need to be there narratively, if that makes sense. But not in order to like shield myself or others, Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's similarly for me. For instance, there's an account in the book of our going to Paris and taking our two children, a daughter and son, to Paris. Well, another couple from Austin and their two boys were along on that trip, and I left them out. First of all, I didn't want more characters than there needed to be, and I didn't want to have to take time to bring these people on stage and have them do things and and then get them off stage and so on, and more names for the reader to remember and all that kind of stuff. It didn't affect the narrative at all. It didn't change anything. So I left them out. And there were a number of decisions like that. And I didn't want anything, there are no enemies, there are no bad guys. I had some question in my book. I had some question about some of the medical things, and I put that in. But I don't. There's no one to blame. There's no one's fault. So. And I didn't have anything. It's all in there. There isn't, except for the kinds of things I was talking about that just aren't relevant to the narrative and only make the book more underbrush in the book that you don't need.
And was there ever a sense for either of you, it sounds like not with Adam, but I think to sort of focus a little more on what Michael's asking too, like where you were sparing yourself saying something that you just didn't maybe want to say or have out there? Or do you think like the process of memoir writing or writing about these things sort of makes that impossible, where if you decide that you're going to tell this story, you're going to tell it true and fully?
Well, I don't know. Somehow that question never came up in my mind as I was writing. I had the trips to Paris. Go to Paris, visit Paris, come home, etc. It's all in there. More, whatever it is there. I refer to some difficult times that Tracy and I had, and didn't go into them other than just saying that they existed, because anyone who's been married and knows that someone who's been married for 35 years, there's things that happen. So I wanted to be clear about that, but I didn't think it needed to be, what was that argument about? I don't, the reader doesn't care. I don't care. Why put it in? So
I think we have time for maybe one more question, though it's a little long. So as you can, Maria asks, how have your families who shared their own grieving around these loved ones reacted to your books? How has writing given your families a shared vocabulary around personal grieving processes? What a good question. It's killing me that we just got it, but beautiful. What have your families thought? Has this helped you talk about this loss?
Well, we're now over 10 years away from the death as a family. I gave my children the manuscript, and then I gave them the galleys. And in both cases, I said, if there's anything in here that bothers you or you want to talk about, let's do it now. And they all said, go for it. So that was the extent of our family discussion.
And Adam, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, you talked about how you wanted to give your children words to talk about depression if they ever needed to. And so I was just thinking about Maria's question about vocabulary. And I don't know.
Yeah.
If you want to comment.
Yeah, I think, I've always had the sense that my fear was that my brother's death would be some kind of mysterious dark cloud hanging over my children's childhood, right? Like that I didn't want it to be the answer to some grand question, like the thing that explained their father when they finally found out about it. I didn't want that to be the case. At the same time, for years, I didn't talk to my oldest. My two younger kids are too young by far. They're 4 and 2, and they didn't know my brother, so it's much more remote for them. But for my oldest daughter, who lived through this, and saw it happen, saw the change in me, in her grandparents, it's been a much more pressing concern. And it was a big deal for me to talk to her about it. My parents have been incredibly supportive of the book. I was a little bit scared to tell them that I had finally written this book, because I didn't know how they would feel about it existing in the world. Years ago, there've been a number of occasions where something would happen in our family and my mother would be like, "You better never write about this." Her mother was a writer, and I think that was kind of the deal that her mother made with her, is, "Look, don't worry, I'll never write about it." I've never made any such deal. And whenever that question comes up, I'm immediately like, "I'll write about whatever I want." But I didn't for like 9 years. I think that my father knew that I always would. And when I explained that I had, and explained that it was important and a part of my process and something I'd always known that I was going to do, they were incredibly supportive. They did read the book, before it was finalized. My father's a professional editor, right? He was in the Boston Globe newsroom for like close to 40 years. So, I was afraid that if nothing else, I was going to get copious notes on grammar. I did get some factual corrections, like this happened in Nicaragua, not Guatemala. And I got a couple of other things like, you ought to change this in consideration of how David's widow might feel, or really just, but it was accuracy stuff more. And, so they've been incredibly supportive, as they always have been, of my career and my writing. And my father said something to me that I thought went above and beyond. And he said, he said that his fear used to be that when I wrote about this, my version of events would not comport entirely with his, that there would be differences, and like how I viewed things, or my sort of analysis of my brother and his, who he was, or all of those kind of things. And he said that at some point he realized that it didn't matter, that my version was just my version, was just the truth for me, and that was okay, and it didn't have to meet up fully with his, or be factually precise in the way that you might expect a news story to be, or whatever. That really impressed me. I really thought that there's support, and then there's that kind of above and beyond, giving somebody license to tell their version of events, no matter how it might differ from your own, that I found actually like very touching.
Cool. I think as writers, we should all hope for that. And that's a really wonderful place to leave it, I think, because we're out of time, so we have to. I want to thank you both so much, Gregory Curtis and Adam Mansbach. Thank you so much for spending an hour with us, telling us about your books. I am so interested in buying copies that aren't advanced copies, and I hope that our audience is as well. If these books are interesting to you, I encourage you to buy them through the Nowhere Bookshop, which we're so grateful to them for their support of the San Antonio Book Festival. And you can find the button on the SABF website to go ahead and order these 2 amazing books. And so one more round of thanks. We can't do applause because we cannot see you, audience, but I know I applaud you. Thank you so much for this. And I hope that you all enjoyed it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the book festival. Thank you so much for coming.